Hello, my name is Brandon Vickers, and I'd like to thank you for joining me in this brief presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about understanding veteran suicide, an interdisciplinary study. In recent years, the issue of veteran suicide has become a much more frequently discussed topic in the public consciousness. A social media campaign began circulating, encouraging people to video themselves performing 22 push-ups every day for 22 days, and each day they would nominate a new person who they challenged to this same task. Now, this was done to raise awareness to a number that was suggested in a 2012 study conducted by the Department of Veterans Affairs, which made the claim that 22 veterans commit suicide in the United States each day. This determination was made based on an analysis of death certificates from 21 states and if they mentioned military service by the deceased. This study gained a lot of attention as people believed that this alarming number was related to the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and soldiers returning home suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. On the contrary, another study of almost 4 million recent veterans conducted by the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry discovered that there was no link between deployment to a combat zone and an increase in the number of suicides. Researchers determined from the data that those who separated from military service had a higher rate of suicide than both those still serving on active duty and the civilian population. Yet another, more comprehensive study was conducted in 2016, spanning 55 million veteran records from 1979 to 2014 from all 50 states, and found that 65% of all veteran suicides were committed by those 50 years of age or older. Clearly, there's a problem in the United States when it comes to veteran suicide, but it's very complex. We can see from the numbers that something seems to be taking place with veterans after they separate from the service that leads to an increased suicide rate. Being a veteran myself, I know firsthand that the military services place a great deal of emphasis on ensuring that transitioning service members are prepared for life in the civilian sector. There are many transition preparation courses that are available for veterans to take advantage of, and there are resources such as counseling and suicide hotlines aimed at suicide prevention. But after the transition out of the service, the access to these services is limited, and one must seek them out to find them. Is a departure from the regimented lifestyle one is accustomed to while serving on active duty to blame? Is there a psychological characteristic that is common among those who gravitate toward military service that also contributes to a propensity toward suicide? What can be done to ensure that those who have sacrificed years of their lives in service to the defense of our nation are taken care of once they are no longer under the watchful eye of military leadership? Understanding how to be there for veterans for the long term is critical in combating this wicked problem. Looking at the questions raised here based on the existing research on veteran suicide, there's not a single discipline which can address this issue on its own. Psychology will be an important contributor when trying to understand what goes on in an individual's mind when they transition from military life, but cannot by itself answer the questions on how to implement a policy through which the problem could be addressed. Nor can psychology answer the question on how to communicate this policy to veterans who have dispersed across the nation, many being located far from any military installations. Therefore, I will examine this problem using an interdisciplinary approach, integrating insights from psychology as well as the fields of organizational leadership and communication studies. The problem with the transition from military service and veteran suicide is what Riddle and Wibber described as a wicked problem in that it cannot literally be solved. Moreover, the hope is to shine a light on some of the lesser discussed aspects of this problem and provide a greater understanding of how this problem can be effectively dealt with going forward. The three disciplinary areas of psychology, communications, and organizational leadership ask some important questions when it comes to the problem of veteran suicide. Psychology asks the question, what leads an individual to completing suicide or to having suicidal ideations? They look at different forms of mental illness such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Psychology also considers triggers for psychological distress such as substance abuse, including alcohol, recreational drug use, and prescription drug abuse. And this discipline also considers what treatments could be used to help improve the condition of people who suffer from these issues. The field of communications asks, how can we best communicate prevention strategies to the veteran community? This can include classroom training to all military members and veterans using VA services, hoping to reach those who need assistance of suicide prevention services through blanket messaging. They also consider how to target their audience to ensure that those in the most at-risk populations receive the message and understand how to get help if needed. People who study the area of organizational leadership ask, what can leaders within the organizational hierarchy do to prevent veteran suicide? This starts within the active duty ranks when implementing suicide prevention efforts. Beginning at the lowest levels of enlisted leadership, members are asked to participate in suicide prevention training, understanding warning signs, and taught how to deal with a fellow service member who he or she believes may be struggling with suicidal thoughts. This extends to leaders within the VA who will look at ways to try to reduce the suicide problem in the veteran community by using chaplains and other trained experts as counselors to those looking for help. The problem with each of these approaches is that none by itself can comprehensively deal with this issue effectively. Simply understanding that these people have mental health issues or substance abuse problems cannot alone help us fully understand the problem. Communication is very important in suicide prevention of any kind, but without insight from a discipline such as psychology, it would be impossible to know what messaging might be effective. Organizational leaders would be lost in trying to figure out what policy to implement if they do not understand effective communication methods. In this paper, I will seek to synthesize these areas to create a more thorough understanding of the problem and how to move forward in these prevention efforts. The discipline of psychology typically looks at problems as how they relate to the individual. What internal processes within a person cause them to behave the way they do. But within the field of psychology, there are also several different sub-disciplines that look at things in different ways from one another. These approaches are behaviorist, psychodynamic, humanistic, cognitive, and biological. Each of these approaches looks at a problem in a different way. The behaviorist approach views everything as motivated by learned responses to various stimuli. The psychodynamic approach looks at psychological issues as mostly subconscious based on life experiences and looks heavily at the impact of sexuality on human behavior. The humanistic approach views the whole person and their feelings and experiences to understand behavior more thoroughly. Cognitive psychologists are concerned with how people think and learn. The biological perspective looks at how the brain functions through natural processes. Often psychology leans on combinations of these perspectives to better understand problems. The research about suicide looks at many different data points, and this includes the number of suicides committed during a period among an age group, race, or sex, the number of suicides among people diagnosed with a mental disorder, and how many people who ultimately completed a suicide had reported suicidal ideations or other acts consistent with suicidal behavior. The data points to the fact that most veteran populations' suicide rate closely mirrors that of the general population. The greatest numbers of suicide deaths among veterans are white, male, and elderly, much like the largest number of civilian suicide totals. They state that there are certain populations within the category of veterans who are most at risk. And I'd like to add here that while the numbers of suicide deaths among veterans are white, male, and elderly, how this corresponds with the civilian suicide total is important, but female veterans actually commit suicide at a higher rate than their male counterparts. Now, all of these at-risk people are people who have clinical depression but are not receiving medication. There are others that are at risk if they are within 12 weeks of beginning medication or within 12 weeks of ceasing taking medication. The other category of veterans who are found to be at risk, like I mentioned, were females who are found more likely than their civilian counterparts to commit suicide. And a problem with the data used is that some of it's conflicting. There has been some data analysis that has shown veteran suicide occurs at a higher rate than civilian suicide, while some other studies have not shown this. Some of the data seems to suggest that there has been a spike in veteran suicide since the start of the Iraq War, while other studies show no correlation. Much of the research in the field of psychology as it relates to this topic identifies statistics of those veterans who have committed suicide and seeks to find correlation to various mental disorders and the treatment of said disorders. While centered on the problem of suicide among veterans on an individual level, the field of psychology seems to miss the possible sociological reasons behind it. When observing the statistical data, there are some questions raised that this discipline ignores because of its singular focus on individual problems that could lead to suicide. The data shows us that there are specific populations struggling with this problem more so than others. This begs the question, what is driving these groups of people to come to this ultimate demise? Could the fact that female veterans are committing suicide at such a high rate be connected to the treatment women receive and the misogynistic nature of military culture? How could leadership help address this issue? Also, why are older veterans being left out by the VA in receiving treatment, and how can they be put in contact with those who can help them in their time of need? These are questions that I believe can be addressed by factoring in other disciplines to aid in our understanding of the issue. Communication is a key component to the issue of veteran suicide, but how can communication studies as a discipline provide insight into the wicked problem of veteran suicide? Per the National Communication Association, communication as a discipline focuses on how humans use nonverbal and verbal messages to create meaning across cultures using a variety of channels and media. The discipline is especially interested in the impact of those messages on human behavior. There are many different subdisciplines that fall under the umbrella of communication studies, many of which could be used when dealing with veteran suicide. This would include mass communications, small group communications, and interpersonal communications. Despite the many areas of this discipline that could be useful in dealing with the problem, there has been minimal research done pertaining to communications and veteran suicide. The data used in the few studies based on communications mirror that used in research in other disciplines. Largely, it's garnered from the major study conducted by the VA, though some other studies are used. Because little research has been done on this topic in the field of communications, it's important to look at some related topics on which a substantial amount of research has been conducted. Some of those areas are general mental health and civilian suicide prevention. Media campaigns in mental health and suicide prevention are mostly ineffective and work best when they are combined with other prevention communication efforts. There have also been efforts to improve communications to those in prevention roles, such as military healthcare providers and VA personnel who encounter at-risk populations. Practitioners in the field of communications have yet to tackle most of the issues dealing with this problem. An important area where there seems to be the biggest gap in research is in how to reach veterans who do not have easy access to VA services and have long since left active duty, where the communications training would seem to be most effective. Organizational leadership goes hand in hand with interdisciplinary studies in that it is an interdisciplinary field itself. Disciplines such as psychology, sociology, and economics have played an important role in research that has been conducted on how leadership within organizations functions. The problem with this is that while many disciplines seem to have had a hand in shaping what we understand about organizational leadership, there fails to be a prevailing integration of these different perspectives of the field. There are, however, several important aspects of this field that are generally agreed upon. Some of the key theories of organizational leadership focus on what makes an individual an effective leader. There are 4 categories of leadership theory: trait theory, behavior theory, contingency theory, power and influence theory. These theories can aid in understanding how organizational leadership can make a difference in the issue of veteran suicide. Based on what we have learned about veteran suicide so far, we know that one of the things that the Department of Defense is trying to do is implement training in the active duty ranks so that members know where to receive help if they're struggling with these issues. If leaders within the organization follow contingency theory and tailor their leadership and training to the personnel who they are leading, this could lead to more effective outcomes. The Department of Defense has conducted research into how they can effectively do this. This research synthesizes organizational leadership and psychology by exploring gatekeeper theory. A gatekeeper is defined as a person in a community who has face-to-face contact with large numbers of community members as part of their usual routine. Utilizing gatekeepers within the ranks and ensuring these people are trained in suicide prevention techniques and understand how to identify at-risk individuals can be an effective step in dealing with this problem. As evidenced by the research from each discipline, there is much overlap between the different fields that have been discussed. There is already much common ground between them. This is important because we cannot fully understand the nuance of this complex problem with any one discipline alone. When it comes to veteran suicide, we cannot view the problem as simply a problem with depression among service members, or that many active duty military members and veterans struggle with substance abuse. Similarly, we can devise an effective plan to communicate prevention strategies, but if we don't understand the root of the problem, would it do any good? Military leaders from the highest ranking generals to the first line non-commissioned officers can act as gatekeepers, well trained in suicide prevention techniques. But what if the military culture is partially to blame? Would those efforts make a difference? The military culture is one that is steeped in tradition. Having served myself, I understand that sometimes it can be viewed as weakness if one is vulnerable and asks for help in tough situations. While leaders try to deal with issues like suicide within their ranks, they must also balance this with staying battle ready. The military is a high-stress environment, and due to the nature of the organization, there's no way to change that. Military members will always be asked to go into harm's way when leadership commands it. But this needs to be balanced with more understanding of the mental side of the individual who is beneath the uniform. The current culture still has misogynistic tendencies where women are more likely to be sexually abused and punished when they step forward in naming their abusers. This too must change. The culture of the military is changing, and it is for the better, but it's not there yet. These cultural issues could be leading to the instances of depression, substance abuse, etc. Messaging about suicide cannot stop the problems that exist which lead to the suicidal thoughts. Using the insights from the disciplines discussed here, we see the problem of veteran suicide and that it clearly exists, and that there's something that's causing veterans to struggle with depression. And there's a need for appropriate messaging to target those who are struggling most with this issue. Using these insights, it will be up to organizational leadership in the military structure, including the Department of Defense and Department of Veterans Affairs, who must ensure they are building a culture which fosters individual well-being while also reaching out to the forgotten veterans who need their help.